Hey, how's it going? This is Mayo, and today I'm going to be talking about how to chat with your Notion docs. So basically, how do you have a chat GPT experience before your Notion documents? So Notion is a really good place to store, different templates, for your knowledge base personally, or if you have a business, you have support documents, or organizing meetings and so on and so forth. Notion is amazing for that. But how do we tap into the ability to effectively search and interact with the document so you can extract information much quicker, whether it's you or a potential customer who wants to interact with your brand? So here is the architecture I've drawn out of how we're going to do this, and this is the overview. So if you haven't watched my previous tutorial, you can check that out. Basically, I go over the basics of using LangChain in Typescript and JavaScript to effectively have this enable this interaction with documents. And so we're going to use LangChain, and LangChain, again, if you haven't watched the video, in a nutshell, is just a framework that allows you to interact with large language models like openai's GPT-3, and also places where you can store these things called embeddings, which is just basically number representations of words, right? And it just makes the whole process of storing, scaling your application, making these queries, retrieving data, it just makes it much easier. So here's the architecture in a nutshell. First, we have your Notion documents right here, and this is going to be, it could be a database, it could be pages, or whatever it is. But the key point at this part is we need to extract your documents from Notion. So we need to find a way to take your documents out of Notion in a format that we can easily split into chunks. So when you export from Notion, you're going to export in Markdown and CSV. Markdown and CSV is an easy format to work with. And once we have that format, we're going to split the text into chunks. Okay, we're going to split the text into chunks because when you send these different instructions to these models, these large language models, they can only take so much per if you want to say a window, or the window of that you're requesting something for. So there's a max number of characters, number of tokens, and so we need to split the text. And also we want to ensure that we don't lose context between different chunks, different text that we split as well. So we split into a chunk, we create these things called embeddings, which is just basically number representations of your documents, like vectors, 0.1 or 0.2, and the whole point is that it makes it much easier for computers to analyze, to retrieve data for you down the line. You store in a vector base, or vector store is just basically a place where you can store these numbers and retrieve them later on. And so this is phase one, and this phase is typically known as ingestion, right? So you're ingesting, the idea being we take your docs and we convert them into numbers and store them. Now once your docs are stored, in this case we're going to use Pinecone, but you can use any other way. You can even just store it locally on your computer. Now we're dealing with a question. So the question comes in. So here, how do I purchase a premium plan? We then search here the store for the relevant documents that match similar wordings, right? So what's going to happen at this stage, actually, if I just correct this real quick, is that we need to convert the query. So let me just grab that. into numbers, right? And so we basically, what we're going to do at this point is we need to convert the query into embeddings, okay? And then we check the store. So at this point, this question is going to be an array of numbers. So it's going to be like 0.1, 0.001, 0.2, and it's just basically tons of numbers to represent these words right here. And then we're going to check this store against those numbers, right? Does that make sense? I'll do a separate tutorial where I explain embeddings a bit more, but in other words, we're just trying to match similarities of numbers, right? So once we get the relevant documents from the store, which is here, we pair those relevant docs with the question, we combine them together, and then we send a prompt, which is basically a request, to the large language model to generate a response based on two of them. So the relevant documents will be the context, the question is the question obviously, and then we have an answer or response. So it could be to upgrade to a premium plan, please visit blah 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 blah. Is there anything else I can help with? Okay, so this is the plan in a nutshell, right? We are getting your docs, split the docs, create the embeddings or the number versions of your docs, ask the question, convert the question into numbers again, compare the embeddings of the question and the store, retrieve the relevant docs, combine the two, send to GPT-3 or whatever, get the answer back. Okay, so in this particular case, we are going to be working with, this is the document I'm going to be working with. You can use whatever other document you want, but cron basically it's a new type of calendar, and what I like about it is it uses Notion, so I was able to quickly use this as an example case study. So you can see cron basically has this is their docs for their application. So you can see cron for iOS. You've got different folders for signing in, connecting, Google Meet, security, setting up, FAQs, the kind of stuff that you would typically see on a home page or an about page or a support page. And so I made this very, very simple application right here, and all it does, I'm gonna share the GitHub repo so you can go check that out. So here it's built on these docs. So let's say, for example, I just type here, how does cron work? And let's press enter. It should pop up in a second. Back. So answer, cron is a calendar app that lets you join and create secured Zoom meetings with a single click, blah 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 blah. So that was retrieved from this entire document, and it's not verbatim. That means it's not word for word, it's an actual, it's supposed to be interactive, right? So let's say I'm trying to figure out how to download cron. Okay, so how do I download cron? Let's search. Let's see what happens. So here, let me just pick one more question. Well, actually, I'll come back to this after we look at the code. You can download cron at blah 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 blah. You need an invite to create cron, so on and so forth. So I hope you get the gist of what we're trying to do today. And so with that in mind, let's jump into the code, okay? So here we go. And I'm just gonna kill all of this now, and let's go to bash. Cool. So basically now we are in the repo. Now let me just walk through what you just saw in the diagram, but I'm just going to walk through it with you slowly this time. So effectively we have the usual config. In here you want to set your keys, so your Pinecone key, which is where is the vector store, so that's where we're going to store the embeddings. Once we've sent them to OpenAI to create the embeddings, which is the numbers, we need to store them in Pinecone. And then we have the OpenAI API key, which is your key from OpenAI. So once you set those two up, you want to jump into config, and in config you want to change your index name and your namespace. I'm going to show you what that looks like in the Pinecone dashboard, but effectively a namespace is a description of your group of vectors that you create, or group of embeddings you create for a specific use case. And then index is like, you can think of as your workspace, right? And then we have Notion here, right? So how this works effectively is these are the Notion files, as you can see, from cron that I extracted. And once you extract them, it's going to come down as a CSV markdown. You drag it into this folder, you unzip the folder so you can run an unzip command I put on the README. When you run that, it's going to unload it here. Now obviously you can just unzip it manually, it's up to you. You should see a bunch of .md files, markdown files, so you can see this calendar views and so on and so forth. And once it's all in here, you want to go and run an npm run ingest, okay? And that's going to run this script in here, ingest data. And ingest data is what we saw in the diagram, right? So I put the visual image here, so I'm just going to jump in so you can see that, you see that in the repo. But this phase right here, if I can zoom in, where you're splitting the text, you're creating the embeddings, you're storing the embeddings, that is right here, okay? So you can see this is directory path, you can change this, and then we process the markdown files. So all the files in here, we basically process them into raw docs in the form that LangChain works with, but it's a combination of text and metadata. Then we split into chunk sizes of 1,000. Again, this is the splitting. Then we send to OpenAI for embeddings. We access the Pinecone index, which is basically, like I said, the workspace. And then we insert into Pinecone index, right? So when you're done ingesting, you should see something like this, okay? So this is my Pinecone dashboard, and you can see this is the index name. This is your environment. Cosine is basically how similarity is conducted, so what method of similarity. These are the number of dimensions per vector. So when you make a query, for example, it's going to have literally 1,536 dimensions, or 1,536 numbers to work with. So it would look something like this, where you just have tons of numbers, right? Way more than that. And then you got your index info. Now, when I ran this command, I saw my new namespace, and obviously you want to change your namespace, and this is the number of vectors that were created from the cron database, right? So you should see all of this in here. And that's basically that in a nutshell. These are your API keys, so you want to go there, get the API key. But I just wanted to show you that once you run it, you should see a new namespace with the vector. So now you've effectively completed phase one of ingestion. Cool. So now we've run that script, we now need to move to phase two. So what is phase two? Well, phase two is once we store the embeddings, now we are working with asking a question, right? And I have basically done all the hard work for you by creating a front end. And you can see in this front end, effectively, you make the query, and the query is sent to the back end, which is API/chat endpoint. And in API/chat, we effectively retrieve the question, sanitize the question, access the Pinecone index, which you just saw. Then we create the vector store. We effectively take that the index, openai, and the namespace. We put that together in an object. Then we use LangChain's vector DBQA chain. So LangChain, if you look at the previous tutorial, you can see that it's very useful for these use cases because it's an abstraction of the complexities of this diagram that I showed you, where what this chain does effectively is it goes into Pinecone, it searches for relevant documents that are similar to the question, it combines the question and the relevant documents together, and then it sends it to OpenAI, and it does it all for you without having to go through the code, one by one. So I think that's really, really beneficial. And then, let's see. So now we got the chain, which you made from we create a chain that consists of the model and the vector store, which I said, and then we call that chain. So that's this part of the diagram, right? So when we call that chain, we're basically running this part of the diagram where we check, then we retrieve, then we combine, and then we send, and we get the answer. And that's all done with LangChain, so that's pretty cool. And then we get the response, and then we send the response back, and that's pretty much it. So in terms of how you get it from Notion, I basically, in the README, you can see the instructions of how to do it and how to get your keys and all that stuff. If I will just jump in here, let me copy that, and effectively, let's jump back here. And so all you're doing in a nutshell is you're going to click on the top right. So I think you have this thing, you should see this thing in your documents. I don't own this, so I can't do anything, but when you click there, you'll see an export, and when you click on export, you'll see this pop-up, and when you see that pop-up, you want to make sure it's marked down in CSV. You want to include the content, you want to include the sub pages, and then you also want to include I think it's the files within the sub pages. So you just want to make sure everything's on. Once you export, like I said, you're going to see a zip in your download folder of your computer, and then you drag that zip into this repo, then you unzip in the repo, and then you should see something like this, Notion DB, right? So that's it basically. Again, let me just showcase how this works. So we're back in cron. And let me see, what else do I want to be interested in? So how do I use calendar views? Okay, let's see. So how do I use calendar views? Let's see what happens. How do I use calendar views? Calendar views. So I haven't actually looked in here. Oh wow, there's nothing in there. I wonder what's going to come back. Oh, interesting. Huh. Wow, that's pretty cool. It must have found that in other parts of the document. That is really cool. So it had a response right there. So yeah, anyway, this is basically in a nutshell how you can create a chatbot for your Notion documents. What I can do in a different tutorial is go over like how to create a Q&A, so it doesn't just stop with the search. You can actually have an interactive session with a bot that will go back and forth. But in terms of support docs, this is usually good enough. So if you have any other questions, any other suggestions for videos, just hit me up, send me an email, or just leave a comment. Cheers.